reawakening because they were political,
Yeah.
they were artistic collaborators. My mother ran a theater and cooked the breakfast and knew where we all were.
At the age of 63, Nell Newman, daughter of the legendary Paul Newman, finally broke her silence in a shocking interview with CBS Sunday Morning. Her revelations did more than raise eyebrows. They shattered the glamorous image Hollywood had so carefully preserved for decades. For behind those iconic blue eyes, once immortalized on the silver screen, there was not the devoted father or the perfect husband the world believed him to be, but rather the portrait of a man living two separate lives. One dazzling life, displayed before the public eye, and another, hidden away, reserved only for the person he truly loved. The most painful truth lay within his final will, a cold document that erased every trace of his family's name, leaving his immense fortune to a mysterious man, identified only by two initials, RR. Who was RR? And what could compel a man so celebrated, so revered, to turn his back on his wife and children in order to protect a forbidden love, a relationship never once acknowledged, not even in his final moments? All of these truths will be unveiled in today's video. In Westport, Connecticut, a serene, opulent suburb where many believe every iron gate opens onto a life of happiness, the reality, as it turns out, was something entirely different. Beyond the iron gates of the Newman estate, young Nell, a fair-haired child who often hid beneath the shade of an old oak tree with her notebook, discovered an early and painful lesson. In this house, certain questions were dangerous. To ask them aloud was to risk losing the affection of your own parents. For a time, I believed my family was perfect, she once recalled, as perfect as the framed photographs lined up on the walls. But photographs never speak, and neither did her family. In Nell's memory, she could not recall a single moment when her parents held hands. Not once. The rare embraces captured for the camera were nothing more than brief performances, as if two weary actors forcing themselves to play out the last scene of a film they no longer wished to star in. Paul Newman, the man whose piercing blue eyes bewitched millions, was, inside his own home, cold and unreachable. Joanne Woodward, graceful, beautiful, and admired by all, would retreat into a silence so heavy it chilled the air whenever her husband entered the room. Nell remembered the day she tried to hold her mother's hand while she stood at the sink. "Are you sad?" she asked softly. Joanne pulled away at once, as if her daughter's touch had burned her. She wasn't angry, she simply didn't know how to reach for another person when emotions were involved. Each morning, Paul left before the sun rose, never explaining where he was going. His returns were unpredictable, sometimes after a few days, sometimes weeks. When he did come back, it was only with the faintest curve of a smile, a ghost of a greeting, before he locked himself away in his study. From behind the closed door, Nell would sometimes hear the sound of low, unguarded laughter during long-distance calls. Yet that laughter was never, not once, shared with her mother. Nell could never forget one bitter winter night in 1972. The silence of the house was pierced by the sharp sound of glass shattering against the floor. She ran toward her mother's room, only to find Joanne on her knees, a fragment of a wine glass clenched in her trembling hand. Her mother's voice broke the stillness, repeating again and again, "You lied again, you lied again." Terrified, Nell whispered, "What did Father do?" Joanne lifted her eyes, lips quivering, and answered in a voice that seemed to wither under its own truth, "Not every man loves women, darling." But Hollywood will never accept that. In that instant, something inside Nell fractured, a childhood illusion collapsing under the weight of revelation. It wasn't long after that she discovered the Polaroid. It had slipped from her father's wallet, and in it Paul Newman was smiling, his arm draped around another man, not in the casual manner of friendship, but with the unmistakable tenderness of love. The way Paul looked at him was not a secret to be mistaken. When Nell showed the photograph to her mother, Joanne snatched it from her hands, tore it into pieces, and fed it to the fire. As the flames consumed the last trace, she whispered with finality, "We will never speak of this. Never." From that night forward, Nell understood the unspoken rules of her home. Never ask where her father disappeared to. Never ask why her mother numbed herself with pills to sleep each night. Never ask why the two of them lived on separate floors and separate beds. And above all, never asked about love. The walls of the house were covered with golden portraits, Oscars proudly displayed like proof of greatness. But for Nell, every frame hung silent, none of them spoke of happiness. Whenever guests arrived at the Newman estate, whether it was Gore Vidal, Robert Redford, or unfamiliar men from New York, the atmosphere of the house changed completely. Paul would appear in immaculate suits, wearing a fragrance no one had noticed before, his charm sharpened for the evening, and it always ended the same way with the sound of his bedroom door locking behind him. No one ever asked who had visited, nor why Joanne slipped away earlier than usual with a pale face and eyes that seemed to have just been crying. The portraits on the walls looked flawless, yet inside the house everything felt hollow, a performance we all pretended to believe. For years Nell thought she was the one at fault for feeling this emptiness, until growing older allowed her to see the signs more clearly. One night she discovered her father in the kitchen, staring at a crumpled letter before setting it ablaze with a silver lighter engraved with the initials GV. When she asked who he had written to, Paul replied in a quiet but cutting voice, "Don't become someone I have to keep a secret from." But the memory that stayed with her most vividly did not come from her father, but from her mother. On a night when Joanne wandered the halls in her sleep, Nell overheard her whisper, almost to herself, "I am not jealous of women. I am only afraid that I will never be enough compared to him." That one sentence tore open the silence that had suffocated the family for decades, and once it was ripped apart, it could never be sewn shut again. The first person who dared to tear open that veil of silence was Nell's brother, Scott Newman. He was the one who asked the most forbidden question in the house, and he paid for it with his life. Scott was unlike anyone else in our family, Nell later admitted in a 2025 interview with CBS, her voice trembling. He was the first to speak aloud the very thing all of us had been choking back with our own blood. Scott, the eldest son, once celebrated in Hollywood as Paul Newman's rebellious double, grew up beneath a blinding light. Yet early on he understood that this brilliance was not glory at all, but the harsh spotlight of a tragedy waiting to erupt. From the moment he was born, the weight of expectation pressed down on him. He carried the Newman name, and with it came the demand to be refined, talented, masculine, successful, just like his legendary father. But even in high school, troubling questions began to gnaw at him. Why had he never once seen his mother hold his father's hand? Why, when Joanne wept, did Paul never go near her? Why, each time Scott whispered, "I love you, Dad," did Paul only smirk and turn away? And worst of all, why was his father so often seen in the company of men who were clearly not just friends? "I still remember the nights I heard my mother sobbing in her room," Nell recalled. Scott would smash his guitar in rage until the neck snapped, while our father sat downstairs alone, pouring himself drinks and staring at the evening news. In 1974, the storm finally broke. At a small party, a drunken boy sneered, "Hey Scott, maybe you should ask your dad if he prefers men or women before you try to follow in his footsteps." Scott erupted, beating the boy so badly he needed 6 stitches, and within a week he was expelled. Paul Newman never came to the school, never faced his son. Instead, he sent a lawyer with a sum of money to quietly bury the matter. Not a word of comfort, not a father's embrace. That night Scott returned home, hurled his old award certificates into the fireplace, and screamed, "You don't protect me. You don't protect Mom." Then, in a voice that cut through decades of silence, he asked the question no one had ever dared to speak: "Who are you really?" But the house remained silent. A year later, Nell discovered a thin notebook hidden beneath Scott's mattress, a notebook she would keep like a relic for years. Inside were pages written in black ink, the lines blurred by tears. "If he doesn't truly love Mom, then who am I? Am I just an accident, or the product of a lifelong cover-up? Was I born out of love, or only to preserve his facade?" The word strangled Nell's heart like a tightening noose. But the greatest shock arrived in 1977, when Confidential Weekly published a black and white photograph taken at Malibu Beach in 1959. In it, a man whose build, face, and stride looked strikingly similar to Paul Newman walked hand in hand with another man. Both wore crisp white shirts and slacks, barefoot on the sand. There were no embraces, no overt gestures, but the tenderness in their eyes made it impossible to dismiss them as mere friends. Hollywood was stunned. The press did not dare state it outright, but rumors once again swelled, accompanied by suggestive headlines: "Who is the man in Paul's life?" and "The hidden side of a masculine icon." At that very moment, Scott was preparing to sign his first action film contract. Then, without warning, he was dropped from the project. No explanation was given, but he overheard a producer mutter, "Audiences will never believe you're a hero if your father is a man living a double life." That night, enraged, Scott smashed the bathroom mirror and dragged a shallow cut across his wrist. The wound was not deep, yet enough to make his mother scream in terror when she found him. Paul was not there. He was in New York, photographed with an associate the tabloids coyly described as his close companion. From that shock onward, Scott spiraled. He changed his phone number, cut ties with his family, and sank into drugs, not to chase a high, but to numb the indifference in the eyes of a father the entire nation adored. Nell remembered calling him once. All she heard was a heavy sigh before the line went dead. The last time they spoke, Scott asked only one question: "Do you think Dad ever truly loved anyone?" She could not bring herself to answer. Nell was only 18 when Scott died, yet in her heart she carried an unshakable truth: he had not been taken by drugs, nor by alcohol. Scott had been consumed by silence. He died because no one in their family had the courage to answer the question that haunted him all his life: did our father ever live in truth? And if he did not, then what truly are we? From the ashes of that pain, Nell slowly came to realize that both her family and her father's legacy had been built layer upon layer of secrets, carefully preserved, never meant to be spoken aloud. One winter night in 1981, the wind howled and snow blanketed the backyard of the Newman estate in Westport. Nell, having just turned 22, walked quietly down the hallway, planning only to fetch an extra blanket from the kitchen. But as she passed her father's study, she froze. A soft yellow glow spilled from the half-closed door, and drifting through the silence came a sound that stopped her in her tracks. It was not the sharp breath of an actor rehearsing lines, nor the weary sigh of a man just off a long phone call. It was deeper, heavier, the kind of sigh that carried the weight of a secret pressing to break free from a chest. Nell stood still for a long moment, then crept closer, her breath caught in her throat. Through the narrow gap of the doorway, she saw Paul Newman seated alone at his desk, a fountain pen clenched in hand, scribbling furiously across a thick stack of paper. What lay before him was not a film script, nor the neat business reports he often reviewed. It was a handwritten letter, stretching across 3 full pages, penned in the same careful handwriting Nell had only ever seen on Christmas cards addressed to her mother. But this time, the letter was not meant for Joanne. The first line of the letter read, "Dear Red, the one who reminds me that I am still human, not merely a symbol." Nell froze. In that moment, it was as if every unanswered question of her childhood had been revealed in the trembling strokes of her father's pen. Paul wrote nothing of cinema, fame, or the trophies that had once defined him. Instead, he wrote about the way Robert Redford's eyes met his under the vast Utah sky as they filmed the final scene of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He wrote about the times when Redford's hand would brush against his shoulder when no one else was watching. And he wrote about nights spent drinking whiskey together on hotel rooftops, sitting in silence like two men afraid that if they ever spoke, the truth between them would become impossible to deny. "There was one night you looked at me, only looked, and I felt as though the entire world had forgiven me. Red, you never had to say a word. But if one day you walked into this room and gave me that look again, I would give up everything, the fame, the family, all of Hollywood." Nell's breath quickened. Her hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped the page. Just then, the telephone rang from the next room. Paul rose from his chair and stepped away, leaving the desk unattended. In a panic, Nell slipped the letter back into place and retreated, shaken, as though she had trespassed into a vault of national secrets. But one truth had seared itself into her mind, never to be erased. Her father had not been writing to a friend. He had been writing to the one who had truly captured his heart. A few weeks later, reality seemed to rise to the surface. Joanne Woodward, who was in California for a Vogue cover shoot, abruptly canceled her schedule and boarded the earliest flight back to Westport. The call came without a number, a voice stripped of identity delivering only one chilling sentence: "If you still care about your marriage, go to the Mayflower Hotel, room 708. That very night, Paul told Joanne he was in New York to meet a partner about a new script. The partner was Robert Redford, the man the press so often described as his soulmate. What happened inside that hotel room no one would ever know. But when Joanne returned to Westport, she carried the silence of a storm. Her face was pale, her arm marked with the shadow of a bruise as if someone had gripped her too tightly, and her reddened eyes, even beneath layers of makeup, betrayed the tears she had shed. That evening the mansion, usually as still as a graveyard, erupted with the sound of breaking objects. There were no shouts, no words, only the shattering of porcelain against the floor. For the first time in decades, the silence of the Newman home was broken not by voices, but by destruction. From that night forward, Paul began to change. He returned to smoking, the habit Joanne had once forced him to abandon in the 60s. He stopped sleeping well, and more often than not Nell found him sitting alone on the porch past midnight, staring into the dark without a word. Sometimes he stood before the mirror gripping a fountain pen so tightly it looked as though it might break in his hand. The smallest accidents began to ignite something inside him. One evening when Nell dropped a Beatles record in the dining room, Paul smashed the baccarat crystal vase that had been a wedding gift to Joanne and left without speaking. He did not shout, he did not curse. Yet the silence he left behind was heavier than violence. Joanne, meanwhile, seemed to wither. She drifted through the house like a shadow, her presence so dim it felt almost ghost-like. From that night on she never again called Paul honey, nor did she ever say my love. When asked by a reporter about Robert Redford, she offered only two clipped words: that man. No name, no title, no trace of tenderness. Nell, still a student of ecology at the time, slowly began to grasp what had been true all along. Her parents' marriage was not love. It was a pact bound by silence, a performance maintained for the world, but empty at its core. For 50 years, their marriage had been a stage play in which two remarkable actors clung to their roles, determined to keep the backdrop from collapsing. Yet one letter, one anonymous phone call, and one hotel room were enough to reveal the cracks that had always been there. From that moment, Nell began to watch more closely. In the back of her father's study, she discovered an old drawer filled with scraps of secrecy. There were lists of phone numbers marked only with the initials R or T, no surnames, some already crossed out, others accompanied by notes that read "call back after 10" or "do not let Joanne know." Behind framed family portraits, she found faded photographs folded into quarters, showing strangers whose eyes lingered far too long, far too tenderly, on her father. Just when Nell thought she had finally begun to understand, another realization struck her. Robert Redford might have been the most important figure, but he was not the only one. In 1981, at the lobby of the Carlisle Hotel, the well-known meeting place of New York's elite, a secret was slipping quietly through its velvet hallways, a secret no one could have imagined unfolding in such a setting. That evening, Nell had only meant to stop by the Carlisle to deliver a stack of documents for her mother. She had just come from an internship interview at a local television station, her head still filled with excitement and youthful hope. But when the elevator doors opened, her world froze into a strange tableau, as if she had stepped into a scene from a family film she had once believed was flawless. Her father, Paul Newman, emerged from the left corridor. Walking beside him was not Joanne, but Gore Vidal, the celebrated writer, the sharp-tongued political voice, the man who had been a close friend of the Newman family for more than 2 decades. Yet that night he did not move with the casual air of a friend. He walked beside Paul with the bearing of a companion, his hand brushing lightly against Paul's wrist, lingering in a quiet gesture of tenderness before pulling away. Thank you for watching the video. Please watch our upcoming videos. Thank you and see you again.